Some beliefs are held so tightly that questioning them feels like shaking the foundation of reality. Yet, when you look closely, the foundation isn't stone, it's sand. In this script, we'll explore 14 ideas within Islam that may sound convincing on the surface, but collapse once you start asking the simplest questions. The first is the claim that the Quran is a perfect, unchanging book. Muslims are told it has been preserved word for word since the 7th century, but history tells a different story. Early manuscripts show variations, and even Islamic scholars admit that entire verses were once recited and are no longer found in the book today. If something is truly divine and eternal, why would human committees be needed to standardize it centuries later? Another is the notion that the Quran contains modern scientific miracles. For example, descriptions of embryology, the shape of the earth, or the formation of mountains. But when you compare these verses with actual science, they either state what was already common knowledge at the time, or they're flat out wrong. Saying that the sky is a roof, or that semen comes from between the backbone and the ribs, isn't divine knowledge. It's pre-scientific guesswork dressed up as revelation. Then there's the belief that prayer 5 times a day, at fixed times, is a direct line to God. But think about it. An all-powerful, all-knowing being supposedly demands millions of people stop what they're doing and repeat the same words at the same times every single day. The routine is less about communicating with a deity and more about reinforcing obedience and group identity. Prayer becomes less a spiritual act and more a surveillance system. Consider the idea of angels recording every action of every person. One on the right shoulder writing good deeds, one on the left writing bad. It's a simple, almost cartoonish image. But if God is truly all-knowing, why outsource this job to invisible clerks? It makes no sense except as a way to create paranoia, the feeling of constantly being watched. A related belief is that the day of judgment will involve weighing deeds on a cosmic scale, good and bad placed like groceries on a balance. Think about how primitive this sounds in the age of neuroscience, of psychology, and law. Human behavior is complex, driven by biology and environment. Reducing morality to tally marks on a celestial scoreboard trivializes everything we know about human decision-making. Then there's the obsession with modesty, particularly controlling women's clothing. The idea is that covering hair or wearing layers somehow protects morality. Yet, in societies with strict dress codes, harassment and abuse still exist. The clothing itself does nothing. What it does accomplish is keeping half of society under constant scrutiny with blame shifted onto them instead of addressing the behavior of men. Another belief is that pigs are unclean not because of real health risks today, but because God declared them so for eternity. Never mind that modern sanitation and refrigeration and cooking eliminate the concerns that might have existed in the desert 1400 years ago. If morality is timeless, why are the dietary laws so clearly tied to a specific environment and time? There's also the doctrine that everything happens by God's will, yet humans are fully responsible for their choices. It's a contradiction baked into the faith. And if a child dies, it's God's plan. If a disaster strikes, it's God's will. Yet if someone sins, suddenly they're to blame. You can't have total predestination and free will at the same time. The belief persists only because it allows religious authorities to excuse suffering while still punishing disobedience. Consider the promise of paradise: gardens, rivers of milk and honey, endless pleasures, but also the infamous image of dozens of virgins awaiting the faithful man. It's telling that heaven is described not in terms of knowledge, discovery, or growth, but in terms of eternal indulgence. The fantasy looks less like divine wisdom and more like the projection of men living in harsh conditions, dreaming of eternal comfort and pleasure. Hell, meanwhile, is painted as eternal fire for unbelievers, a punishment so extreme it dwarfs any crime. Think about this logically. Infinite punishment for finite actions is not justice, it's cruelty. A God who burns people forever simply for disbelief is indistinguishable from a tyrant demanding blind loyalty. The belief in jinn, supernatural beings made of smokeless fire, is another curious holdover. These spirits are blamed for everything from bad luck to mental illness. But modern science has explained epilepsy, schizophrenia, and anxiety without resorting to invisible creatures. Yet exorcisms still happen, and people still suffer because communities cling to medieval explanations instead of medical ones. Then there's the ritual of fasting during Ramadan. It's claimed to build empathy for the poor. But skipping meals during daylight hours doesn't replicate poverty. Poverty is about not knowing when or if food will come, not voluntarily waiting until sunset for a feast. The ritual again functions more as a loyalty test than a real moral exercise. Another belief is that sacred cities like Mecca and Medina are inherently holier than other places on earth. Yet these are just ordinary stretches of desert. Their status comes only from human declaration. If holiness were real, why would it be geographically confined to spots that conveniently align with political and economic power throughout history? Finally, there's the idea that Islam is the final and perfect religion, the completion of all previous revelations. But every religion has made the same claim at some point. Each one insists it's the last, the ultimate, the true path. This pattern alone reveals the human origin of such beliefs. It's the same script recycled across cultures with different names and details. When you line up all these beliefs side by side, the cracks are obvious. They reflect the fears, desires, and ignorance of the time they were created, not eternal truths. What makes them endure is the social and emotional pressure to never question them. Once you do, the whole picture shifts, and what once seemed sacred looks very human after all. When people defend these beliefs, they often rely on repetition rather than reasoning. Take the idea that the Quran predicted modern science. You'll hear about the expanding universe supposedly mentioned in a verse, but the text itself is vague as it can just as easily be read as poetic language about the sky. What's striking is that believers only notice these so-called predictions after science has already discovered the facts. Never before, no one used the Quran to launch satellites, cure diseases, or predict atomic theory. That's because the knowledge isn't there. It's read into the book after the fact. The same goes for embryology. Defenders claim the Quran described stages of development in the womb, but ancient Greek physicians like Galen already described these ideas centuries earlier. His works were translated and widely known in the Middle East at the time. If divine revelation repeats the medicine of the era and gets details wrong, what makes it divine? The miracle claim fades once you place it in a historical context. Let's circle back to prayer. In theory, it's meant to bring peace and focus. In practice, it often creates guilt. Miss a prayer, and you feel you've let God down. Travel, work, school, health, none of that excuses you from the ritual. This guilt system works perfectly for maintaining control. People who feel they're constantly falling short are easier to manipulate. They become dependent on the very structure that's weighing them down. And what about angels recording deeds? This belief taps into a deep psychological mechanism, the fear of being watched. Experiments in behavioral science have shown that even a picture of eyes on a wall increases honesty in test subjects. The idea of invisible beings tracking your every move is like the ultimate surveillance camera. It conditions people to police themselves even when no one is around. That's not divine oversight. It's psychological conditioning. The Judgment Day scenario adds another layer. Bodies resurrected from graves, books opened, scales brought out. On one level, it's a dramatic story. On another, it's absurd. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen. Billions of people have lived and died. Are we to believe all of them will stand in a literal queue waiting for their turn? And if God is beyond time and space, why would he need a courtroom drama to sort things out? The imagery makes sense as a metaphor invented in an ancient society, but collapses under modern scrutiny. Let's talk more about modesty. The fixation on women's clothing is not just about fabric. It's about power. When you control how people dress, you control how they move, how they think, how they interact. It's a constant reminder of authority. Women are told that their very bodies are a source of temptation. The result is a culture of shame, where responsibility for men's behavior is shifted onto women. Studies in countries with strict dress codes show no reduction in abuse or harassment. That fact alone exposes the hollowness of the claim. The pig taboo offers another example of beliefs tied to context. In hot desert climates without refrigeration, avoiding pork may have had practical benefits, but declaring it eternally forbidden shows the human fingerprint of the rule. Today, with global food safety standards, pork can be cleaner than other meats, yet millions still view it as inherently dirty. It's not about hygiene anymore, but obedience. That's the thread running through many of these beliefs. Rules that once made sense locally turned into unquestionable absolutes. The contradiction of free will and predestination deserves more time. If everything is written, then every crime, every tragedy, every choice was already planned. Punishing people for actions they couldn't avoid makes no moral sense. On the other hand, if free will is real, then God doesn't have total control. Islamic theology tries to have it both ways, but the tension never resolves. Philosophers have debated this for centuries, yet believers still cling to the contradiction without addressing its implications. Paradise imagery reveals another human element. When you read descriptions of heaven, it's not about higher understanding or transcendence. It's about never-ending food, drink, and sex. This tells you more about the desires of 7th century tribes than about ultimate truth. If eternal life exists, wouldn't the highest form of fulfillment be something beyond bodily pleasures? But the fantasy remains stuck in earthly cravings, showing its very human origin. Hell's depiction, on the other hand, is rooted in fear. Eternal fire, boiling water, skin replaced again and again. The cruelty is not hidden, it's emphasized. Fear is one of the most effective tools of control. When you terrify people with visions of torment, you don't need evidence. You just need imagination. And because hell is invisible, the threat can never be disproven. It becomes the ultimate stick to pair with the carrot of paradise. Jinn are another fascinating case. They are blamed for sleep paralysis, strange dreams, or sudden illness. But neuroscience, psychology, and medicine have already explained these experiences, yet in many Muslim communities, people still turn to faith healers instead of doctors. The consequences can be devastating. People with epilepsy restrained during exorcisms, women with depression accused of being possessed. These aren't harmless myths. They are harmful practices keeping people from real help. Fasting is often portrayed as empathy training, but genuine empathy comes from listening, sharing, and acting, not from scheduled hunger. What fasting does achieve is visible solidarity. Everyone around you knows you're participating. It becomes a badge of belonging. Break the fast in public, and you risk shame or even punishment. The ritual is less about compassion and more about signaling loyalty to the group. Sacred geography deserves attention too. The belief that Mecca and Medina are inherently holier than other places creates strange contradictions, and millions spend life savings to circle a cube of stone in Mecca, believing this physical act brings divine favor, yet outside those borders, the same acts hold no value. Holiness tied to coordinates on a map looks arbitrary when you step back. It serves religious institutions economically and politically, but offers no universal truth. Finally, the claim that Islam is the perfect final religion. This mirrors the same claim made by earlier faiths. Christianity declared itself the final covenant. Judaism claimed to be the chosen path. New sects claim to correct the mistakes of the old. Each insists it is the ultimate truth, while dismissing all others. The pattern itself exposes the mechanism. Religions evolve, adapt, and compete, but none of them escape the fact that they're human-made systems. And here's the deeper insight. The most foolish beliefs endure not because they're convincing, but because questioning them comes with social costs. People risk losing family ties, community acceptance, even personal safety. So the beliefs stay in place, not through reason, but through pressure. Once you recognize this, the whole system looks less like divine wisdom and more like social engineering. When defenders say the Quran has been preserved word for word, they rarely mention the competing recitations that still exist today. Hafs, Warsh, Qalun, these are not minor pronunciation differences. In some cases, they change the meaning of entire verses. For example,
whether a command is directed at one man or at all men. That matters. If a divine message can't be agreed upon even among believers, what does perfect preservation really mean? The idea of scientific miracles deserves more time because it's repeated endlessly. Take the claim about mountains being pegs to stabilize the earth. Geology tells us mountains are actually the result of tectonic collisions. They don't hold the earth down like tent stakes. Yet this verse is touted as proof of divine knowledge.
This is how faith and confirmation bias interact. Believers highlight vague phrases that sound scientific while ignoring everything that's clearly wrong, like the sky being described as a ceiling that could fall. Prayer is another fascinating subject. Consider how rigidly it's enforced. Entire societies structure daily life around these fixed times. Alarms, loudspeakers, mandatory pauses, even in airports or offices, people rush to find a corner to perform the ritual. It's not about connection with the divine, it's about public performance. Everyone sees who obeys and who doesn't. The collective rhythm becomes a way of monitoring conformity. And if you don't take part, you stand out immediately. The angels on your shoulders, the cosmic accountants, also reveal something deeper about human psychology. From childhood, believers are taught that unseen beings record their every word and thought. That message burrows into the subconscious. Decades later, even if faith weakens, the feeling of guilt often remains. This is why people raised religious can feel anxious about harmless choices. The mental residue of invisible surveillance doesn't vanish overnight. Judgment Day myths also bring practical consequences. When people believe life on earth is just a test before eternal sorting, this world matters less. Environmental crises, social injustice, inequality, why care deeply if all of it is temporary compared to heaven or hell? This belief can sap urgency from real-world problems. The promise of cosmic justice becomes a substitute for fighting for justice here and now. The modesty doctrine does more than regulate clothing. It shapes entire economies and cultures. Billions of dollars go into producing, marketing, and policing acceptable clothing. Meanwhile, women who resist are labeled immoral, disobedient, or even dangerous. The social cost of resistance is enormous. And that's the point. By making women the carriers of community honor, the system ensures half the population is always under scrutiny. Food restrictions like the pork ban are a window into how religion fossilizes local customs. In ancient times, survival often depended on trial and error. If a food made people sick, it was avoided. That's practical. But when those discoveries are rebranded as divine decrees, they outlive their usefulness. They become eternal shackles. Even when circumstances change, the rule survives, not because it still makes sense, but because questioning it means questioning God. The predestination problem is not just philosophical. It affects how people see themselves. When tragedies happen, victims are told, "It was written." This can discourage people from seeking real solutions, whether medical, social, or political. Why fight injustice if it was God's plan? Why invest in prevention if every outcome is predetermined? The doctrine drains human responsibility while still blaming individuals when convenient. Paradise fantasies, when examined closely, also reinforce patriarchal structures. The imagery centers on male pleasure, flowing wine, reclining couches, endless virgins. Women, on the other hand, are promised vague notions of companionship, but never the same level of indulgence. This reflects the social hierarchy of the time. Men were the authors, so heaven was written in their image. It says less about eternity and more about who held power on earth. The nightmare of hell has shaped generations with trauma. Children are told graphic stories of burning flesh, boiling water, and chains. These images lodge in the mind long before critical thinking develops. Even adults who leave the faith often struggle with hell anxiety for years. It's psychological abuse disguised as moral teaching. Fear this intense doesn't make people good. It makes them obedient. And fearful obedience is not morality. Belief in jinn has practical costs that ripple across communities. Instead of seeing epilepsy as a medical condition, families may lock away relatives, fearing possession. Instead of seeking therapy for depression, they may hire an exorcist. In some tragic cases, these rituals involve violence, starvation, or neglect. What could be treated with science becomes prolonged suffering. This is how superstition, when institutionalized, harms the most vulnerable. Fasting, too, reveals contradiction. It's claimed to build empathy, yet many fast-breaking meals turn into extravagant feasts. Restaurants overflow, tables bend under piles of food. The ritual that was supposed to teach simplicity often becomes the opposite. This isn't about empathy, it's about ritualized scarcity followed by indulgence. And because it's tied to identity, few stop to question whether it achieves its stated goal. The holiness of Mecca and Medina also fuels political control. Saudi Arabia profits enormously from pilgrimage. Millions pour in every year, spending fortunes to perform prescribed rituals. This isn't just spirituality. It's a business empire wrapped in divine branding. Declaring specific places sacred allows rulers to monopolize access, wealth, and authority. The belief props up power rather than pointing to any actual spiritual reality. The claim of Islam as the final religion ties all these threads together. It positions itself as the answer to everything: morality, science, politics, law. But in doing so, it discourages questioning. If something is perfect, it can't be improved. If it's final, it can't be revised. That's how progress gets frozen. Any challenge becomes rebellion. Any update becomes heresy. Perfection becomes a prison rather than a path to truth. And here's the key realization: in these beliefs, while foolish in themselves, gain power through community. Enforcement alone, a person might doubt them, but it's surrounded by family, neighbors, and leaders who all reinforce the narrative. Questioning becomes dangerous. This is why even obvious contradictions survive for centuries. Not because they're strong, but because the social cost of doubt is higher than the intellectual cost of belief. What's striking is how many of these beliefs serve purposes other than truth. They create unity, they maintain authority, they channel wealth, they enforce obedience. The Quran's supposed perfection keeps people from questioning. Prayer schedules keep people synchronized and visible. Angels and judgment scales keep people self-policing. Modesty rules keep women constrained. Food bans keep identity distinct from outsiders. Paradise and hell keep people motivated by reward and fear. Each belief may sound spiritual in isolation, but together they function as a system of control. History shows this clearly. When Islam expanded, it didn't spread only through persuasion. It was enforced by law, by armies, by social contracts. Beliefs became binding because rejecting them meant losing safety, community, or even your life. Once people are born into this framework, they inherit the package of beliefs without choosing them. That's how they become normalized. Not because they make sense, but because they're unavoidable. Psychology also explains why foolish beliefs endure. Humans are wired for pattern seeking, for agency detection, for tribal loyalty. Seeing intention behind random events once helped our ancestors survive. Today, it makes us prone to thinking unseen beings control everything. Loyalty to the tribe once meant survival in small groups. Today, it makes people cling to beliefs that divide the world into us and them. These instincts are powerful, and religion exploits them perfectly. Another reason these beliefs persist is that questioning them is framed as moral failure. If you doubt, you're not just wrong, you're wicked. You're accused of arrogance, of rebelling against God, of loving sin more than truth. This emotional framing keeps many intelligent people locked in silence. They may notice contradictions, but the fear of being labeled immoral shuts down honest thought. In this way, foolish ideas survive not because they're convincing, but because they're protected by guilt and fear. It's also worth noting how selective belief works. For instance, Muslims reject other religions' claims as silly or false, while insisting their own are beyond question. They laugh at Greek myths about gods on Mount Olympus, but defend stories of jinn. They dismiss Hindu cosmology, but insist their own tales of judgment and paradise are factual. This double standard shows that faith isn't about evidence. It's about loyalty to what you've been taught. The economic dimension can't be ignored either. Beliefs generate industries, in the pilgrimage industry, the halal certification industry, the modesty fashion industry, the publishing of religious materials. None of these thrive on questioning. They thrive on repetition. The more people accept these beliefs, the more money flows into institutions that reinforce them. The cycle becomes self-sustaining, and then there's the cost to personal freedom. Beliefs about angels, hell, modesty, fasting, or predestination can shape every aspect of life. People grow up with invisible boundaries that dictate what they eat, what they wear, how they think, how they speak, even what they dream about. That's the hidden tragedy. Not just that the beliefs are foolish, but that they limit human potential. Entire lives are shaped around rules that dissolve when exposed to reason. Think about education. In some Muslim-majority countries, students are taught that Quranic science takes priority over actual science. Astronomy is filtered through scripture. Biology is censored where it conflicts with doctrine. History is rewritten to protect religious pride. This keeps young minds trapped in circular thinking. It protects faith at the cost of truth. The foolishness of the beliefs becomes generational, passed on as unquestionable knowledge. And yet, when people begin to step outside, the picture changes quickly. Once someone allows themselves to ask, what if this isn't divine? The dominoes start falling. The Quran's contradictions become obvious. Angels look like metaphors. Paradise and hell like fairy tales. Jinn like folklore. Suddenly, what seems sacred looks like mythology alongside every other human invention. That moment of clarity is powerful and terrifying. What makes the 14 beliefs especially damaging is that they're not just abstract. They affect how societies function. The fear of hell influences laws. The obsession with modesty shapes gender roles. The notion of predestination dampens responsibility. The holiness of Mecca fuels political power. Each belief has real-world consequences. They're not harmless traditions, but forces that shape millions of lives in ways that hold back progress. If you zoom out, the pattern is unmistakable. Every religion has its set of sacred but questionable claims. What makes them survive is not logic, but the weight of culture. People believe because everyone around them believes. They act because everyone else acts. They repeat what they've been told because that's safer than questioning. But the moment enough people step back and see the system for what it is, the illusion begins to crack. That's the invitation here. It's not to mock or insult, but to notice. To look at beliefs that have been passed down unquestioned and ask whether they hold up. Whether they actually reflect truth, or whether they're tools of control. Whether they elevate human life or whether they keep it small. Take the belief in angels again. In modern times, when satellites orbit the Earth, when AI can process trillions of data points in seconds, the idea of invisible beings hovering to jot down every sneeze or slip of the tongue feels outdated, yet millions still repeat this idea daily without a second thought. The real question is not whether it's true, it clearly isn't, but why it persists. And the answer lies in how fear and comfort work together. It's comforting to think someone is watching when you do good, and terrifying to think someone is watching when you do bad. Either way, the belief binds you. Judgment Day. Imagery plays the same dual role. For those who suffer, it promises cosmic justice. For those in power, it justifies the system. Don't rebel. Don't demand too much. Everything will be sorted later. This is a brilliant mechanism if your goal is stability, but it's disastrous for progress. Societies that wait for justice in the afterlife rarely fight hard enough for justice in the present. The rules on modesty highlight another recurring theme: the shifting of responsibility. Instead of teaching men to control themselves, the entire burden is placed on women. Cover your hair, cover your body, cover your face. If men misbehave, blame women. This belief is foolish not only because it's unjust, but because it doesn't work. Data from strict societies proves harassment and abuse don't disappear, but the rule endures, not for truth, but because it reinforces male authority. Food restrictions also divide communities. Halal versus haram becomes another line of identity, another way to separate insiders from outsiders.
This might have made sense for a tribe trying to define itself 1,400 years ago. But today it fragments societies unnecessarily. What you eat becomes a moral test rather than a personal choice. That's how foolish rules expand their reach, by attaching morality to everyday actions. Predestination and free will is perhaps the most frustrating contradiction because it undermines its own logic. If everything is written, then even disbelief is written, which means non-believers are only fulfilling what God already planned. Punishing them becomes absurd. Yet this is exactly what's preached, that you're free to choose, but your choices are already scripted. It's a belief that collapses into incoherence the moment you stop to examine it. Paradise promises keep people dreaming instead of acting. If you're struggling, you're told to be patient. Your reward is waiting. If you're oppressed, don't fight too hard. Paradise will fix it. If you're poor, don't worry. Rivers of milk and honey wait. The foolishness is not in the dream itself. Everyone dreams of a better life, but in how it's used to pacify real suffering. Hope is hijacked and redirected into fantasy instead.
Of fueling change, hell works in the opposite way. If paradise sedates, hell intimidates. The idea of eternal flames for disbelief turns the most basic human freedom, the freedom to think, into a crime. You're told that asking honest questions could land you in fire forever. This is thought control at its purest. It's why many ex-believers describe not just doubt, but trauma. The images of torment are planted young, before reason develops, ensuring obedience through fear. Belief in jinn may seem harmless folklore, but it shapes real behavior. People blame sickness or misfortune on possession, and that directs them away from actual solutions. Families spend fortunes on exorcisms. People suffer in silence instead of seeking therapy. Children are traumatized by violent cures. The foolishness is not just believing in mythical beings, but the real harm caused by refusing to accept natural explanations. Fasting shows how rituals can lose their original meaning. It's said to build empathy, but in practice, it often leads to competitive feasting. The sight of lavish banquets after sunset undermines the entire point. And yet the ritual is repeated every year without challenge because the power lies not in empathy, but in group performance. The fast marks who belongs and who doesn't. That's why it survives, even if its logic fails. The holiness of Mecca and Medina ties belief to geography. People save their whole lives to walk around a cube of stone, believing this act brings eternal favor. But strip away the story, and it's just a structure in a desert. The power lies entirely in the narrative. Declaring a place holy ensures control over it. It funnels wealth and devotion to those who guard it. The belief is foolish not because people feel reverence, but because the reverence is based on nothing but inherited claims. The finality of Islam is perhaps the most transparent of all. Every religion has said the same thing, that it's the last, the complete, the final truth. Yet each one eventually faces the same reality. Time moves on, knowledge grows, and what once seemed complete begins to crack. Declaring perfection is a way to freeze progress, to protect a fragile system from change. But human curiosity always pushes forward. That's why even in the most rigid societies, people quietly question. When you look at all 14 beliefs together, the thread is clear. None of them stand up to scrutiny. They persist not because they're true, but because they're useful. Useful to leaders, to communities, to traditions that value obedience over reason. That's why they're still taught, still defended, still enforced, not because they explain the world better than science or guide morality better than philosophy, but because they serve as glue for a system that fears collapse if people think too freely. The real cost is human potential. Time. Energy and creativity that could go into solving real problems are instead spent memorizing rituals, defending contradictions, and fearing punishments that don't exist. The most foolish beliefs are not just silly ideas, they're obstacles to growth. The moment someone dares to question them honestly, they begin to see a wider horizon, a world where morality doesn't depend on fear, where knowledge doesn't hide behind scripture, where meaning is built through living rather than waiting. And maybe that's the point worth ending on. Foolish beliefs don't vanish because someone proves them wrong. They vanish when people realize they don't need them. When they see that life is richer, freer, and more meaningful without the chains of fear and superstition. When that happens, the beliefs shrink back to what they always were. Stories from another time, no longer binding, no longer sacred, no longer obstacles, just relics of human imagination